Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have on Josh Fernandez, author of the new book, The Hands That Crafted the Bomb, The Making of a Lifelong Antifascist. It's a really interesting sort of autobiography of Josh and his life as somebody who struggled with drug and alcohol abuse, somebody who has been engaged in anti-fascist politics, somebody who has faced professional backlash because of his politics. And the book is incredibly well written and engaging. Once you start reading it, it sort of sucks you in. I really enjoyed the book, even if you obviously don't know who Josh is. His writing is really good, and the book itself is a really fascinating glimpse into a really intense life. Good, bad, and ugly, and a very, very intense life. He's a super cool dude. We had a super cool conversation, and so I'm going to share it with you today. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Josh Fernandez with his new book that just released by PM Press, The Hands That Crafted the Bomb, The Making of a Lifelong Antifascist. Enjoy.
Hey, I'm Josh Fernandez. I'm a anti-fascist organizer. I just came out with a book on PM Press called The Hands That Crafted the Bomb, The Making of a Lifelong Anti-Fascist. And it basically chronicles my life until my work investigated me for anti-fascist organizing, and their attempt was to fire me. So the book kind of goes back into my past and relives all kinds of crazy experiences leading up to that incident. I live here in Sacramento, and I'm a writing professor.
Nice. Yeah, very cool. A person of many talents. I really enjoyed reading the book. Again, the book is called The Hands That Crafted the Bomb, The Making of a Lifelong Anti-Fascist. Of course, we will link to it in the show notes. Encourage people to check it out. To maybe start this conversation, there's so much to get into here. But can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to write the book? And also, I'm interested in some of like your literary influences.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to write the book. I actually started out as notes while I was going through this investigation that my work was doing. I just started writing all these notes. And it was basically just to quell my rage because I was so pissed that they were putting me through this investigation where they thought I was trying to lead students into dangerous situations. It just started out as these rageful notes. But after the investigation was over, I started crafting it into a book. So it took me about a year to write the book after writing all those notes.
And I know you're an English professor. I know you have obviously knowledge about, literary traditions and history. Do you have any particular literary influences?
It's kind of funny because I've been thinking about this a lot. When I was really little, I just started to read everything that I thought was like a counter perspective. So I remember when I was 13, I read Karl Marx, and I had no idea what it was about. Like, there's no way I could have understood what it was about. But I just knew it was kind of badass, and that, like, a lot of people disagreed with it.
Yeah.
So like, that was kind of my entry point into reading. And then, I started reading people like Celine, and I was really into that kind of like weird voyage kind of writing, and I didn't realize until later that Celine was like a full-fledged fascist.
Oh man.
Yeah, so that kind of turned me off, and I've always been trying to find like the perfect author, but growing up I read just a lot of regular stuff like Hemingway and Charles Bukowski and things like that. And so I kind of formed my writing style based on people like that and Dennis Johnson. And it wasn't till, I got into college where I started to really broaden my horizons in the literary genres.
Nice. Yeah, no, when I was reading your book, I literally had down written Bukowski, because I got a little bit of, nothing like overwhelming or anything, but I got a little hint of Bukowski in some of your writing for sure. I even had Henry Miller written down as a possible literary influence, just for that earthy, no holds barred. This is the nuts and bolts of my life, even when it's at its absolute messiest, and that sort of reminded me of those two authors in particular.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that.
Well, you're in your book, you jump around in your own sort of lifespan, and you go to the present, you go back to the past. So I guess we could probably do that with this interview as well. And one of the questions that I wanted to sort of ask, and that you've already touched on, is like the centrifugal force around which your book orbits is this sort of backlash you're getting from your employers related to your anti-fascist organizing. So can you kind of lay out that controversy, what happened, why, how the backlash started, etc., and then we can kind of jump around into other aspects of your story.
Yeah, so I got hired for a full-time teaching position, which was a tenure track. And so during that tenure track process, it's almost like you're on probation. And that was sort of during like Trump presidency time, where a lot of my students were coming into my office and they just didn't feel safe on our campus, which is like a majority white campus. And a lot of brown and queer students were like gathering in my office, like, what can we do? So we ended up starting a chapter of the Campus Anti-Fascist Network, which is basically just a club. It's like a campus club, just like any other club, where really we just sat around and kind of communed. But the administration got wind of that and really started to come down on me. So their purpose was to take away my tenure before I could actually get it. So they put me through this investigation that lasted a year.
Damn. And what was the conclusion of that investigation?
It was unfounded. So yeah, it was crazy because they would like pull students out of classrooms. They pulled professors out of classrooms, staff, faculty, all kinds of people out of classrooms for an entire year. And I don't know how much money they wasted with that lawyer and the investigation firm, but they must have wasted like hundreds of thousands of dollars conducting this whole thing. And it ended up being like this 130-page document at the end. And really the basis was just unfounded in big, bold letters.
Now, it was just your sort of the anti-fascist organization that you had on campus, or did they go deeper into your past to some of the other stuff you've done outside of the arena of being a teacher or anything involved with the campus?
No, I'm so glad they didn't go into my past, because I would have been completely screwed on that front. But it was really just anti-fascist organizing, and they went through all these news clips of like protests in the area to like see if I was there. And some of them I was there with students, and we were just like literally protesting with signs and stuff. Mm-hmm. So the investigator wrote that in her report. She's like, yeah, they were there, but it was just, they were just waving signs, and protest is still legal in this country. So there's nothing they could do about that, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I was, myself, I started off even before this show doing anti-fascist organizing locally. And actually this show grew out of local organizing on the ground here in Omaha because we're trying to think of like extending our political education arm of our new organization that was sort of fundamentally about, or at least originally started with anti-fascism and evolved into like mutual aid and various other things. But, before Trump and the protests that ensued in those coming years afterwards, to be an anti-fascist is sort of like taken for granted. It wasn't a scary word, or it wasn't like a hot topic of debate. In fact, I remember in the Trump years, like all the old like CNN and Fox News hosts and stuff having to like pronounce Antifa for the first time and not being able to do it. Yeah. So it was so much out of the popular mainstream cultural zeitgeist in the U.S. to even really know what Antifa was or anything like that. But with the Trump era and all the protests that ensued, there was now a calculated effort, particularly by the political right in this country, led, of course, by Trump, to demonize anti-fascism and to make it into a scary, violent sort of thing when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of it is like we oppose fascism. Isn't that what everybody should be doing? So
Totally.
it's kind of a curious little shift, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that shift as somebody who was in anti-fascist organizing for many decades before it became a popular American mainstream thing.
I mean, to be fair, sometimes I have trouble pronouncing Antifa. So I don't know how to, like, is it Antifa or Antifa?
I think
I don't
both
know.
work. Yeah.
Yeah, it just depends on my mood. Uh, but yeah, it's so weird because just that cultural divide in our country, it's almost cliche to talk about now. Like the divide in our country, as if there wasn't always a divide.
Yeah.
But everything was so heightened after. So like just this culture war that's being waged is like everything you do is magnified times 10,000. So like anti-racism is magnified times 10,000 and like organizing is magnified. It's just so weird. So like yeah, it's just an awkward situation because anti-fascism is almost a given.
Hmm.
But the fact that the word has been politicized in this weird way, it like now it means a different thing. And it's like this cultural connection that's like good or bad, and people see the word anti-fascist and they think they know everything about who you are and what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I assume that backlash you faced by the administration was, of course, part and parcel of that moment in time in which Antifa was being, like, purposefully demonized and turned into this big threat, even though literally you're just hanging out and like building community with one another on campus, which should be totally down the middle of the line of what is acceptable on any college campus, right?
Yeah, totally. And the thing is, like, we didn't check your membership card or anything. We didn't like, and we had conservatives show up, and we had actually like alt-right conservatives show up
Mm.
and like do their little curious questioning thing. And like nothing happened to them. They'd sit there and get bored out of their minds because we were just like making zines or whatever.
Yeah.
But the administration really thought they were going to come into my classroom and see me teaching in Black Bloc or something like that,
Yeah, yeah,
which
yeah,
which never happened for the record.
yeah. I remember, because you kind of talk about your earlier life, and I remember like in the '90s, like the neo-Nazi movement, like it was, certainly was there. It was sort of dovetailing with the militia movement in the '90s, the anti-government, right-wing reactionary movement. But there was still a sense in which like fascists and neo-Nazis were sort of like a spectacle. Like you would see them on like Jerry Springer, and everybody in the audience would like hate the Nazis, and they'd come out and they'd be just like assholes, and it was just sort of like an absurd spectacle. But there was no, and maybe I'm wrong because I sort of was pretty young in the '90s, but it felt like something has shifted in recent years, where it's not that there's never been a fascist or neo-Nazi presence in the United States by any means, but that especially like post Charlottesville, things have really escalated in a new way. And still to this day, you see groups like Patriot Front. I mean, just this week, right, marching through major cities, flying swastika flags, and I just wonder if you think that fascism and the way it's organized has changed in your lifetime, especially given your experience as an anti-fascist over many years. Are we living in a time of like a renewed resurgence of fascism? Are there more fascists now, or more organized fascists now than there were in the past? Do you have any beat on that?
Yeah, when I was younger, it was way different because it was just boneheads, like neo-Nazi boneheads at
Mm.
shows. And so like because my world was so small and I was just a little kid, it was a huge problem. But I think in the grand scheme of things, really, like Nazi boneheads weren't a problem um, as much in the 80s. The fact that like nowadays they're really kind of wisening up and attaching themselves to the Republican Party um, is a huge problem. And yeah, it's if you've looked at Trump's plan, what is it, America 2025 plan or whatever it is, I mean, it's really to develop a Christian nationalist nation. And so like these are all words that neo-Nazis love to hear. And they're organizing around these buzzwords that conservatives are using. And that's why we're seeing a resurgence of these groups, and they're not looking like scary neo-Nazi boneheads anymore. They're wearing, their Dockers,
Hmm.
and and then they're all organized with their white shirts and their flags, and they do these banner drops, and it seems like there's a lot of them. So yeah, they're really trying to sort of blend in with school boards. They're trying to blend in with city councils. They're showing up at city council meetings. Yeah, they're organized, and they're growing, and it's becoming part of the fabric of our nation once again.
Yeah, and I think you really hit on something when you talk about the sort of institutionalization of these movements, whereas before, it's not that there weren't reactionaries or right-wing asshole Republicans, there always have been,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
even Democrats for that matter. But it's this like the marriage of like the more street movements, like like the Proud Boys and their relationship with Trump, and like yeah, the influence that these like now explicit fascists of various sorts are having on mainstream Republican politics. I think that is something that is relatively new, at least in its overtness. And it's kind of that, like you were saying, that Richard Spencer, David Duke innovation where you move away from like the bonehead aesthetic, the prison tattoo Nazi aesthetic, and you move more into like a polite society, hair and clothing style and approach that seems very reasonable and seems kind of moderate in its aesthetic, but is all the more dangerous for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't help that the neo-libs and the Democrats are kind of like, the just let them have their say. This is free speech, and we don't want to like resort to their level by causing any harm or anything.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't help squash the movement.
No.
So we have enemies on both sides now.
Yeah, and the Republicans have no qualms about doing that with the left. So I just recently saw like a Truth Social post by Trump, who's talking like if I get elected again, we're going to get rid of the Marxist, we're going to get rid of the socialist and the
Yes.
communist. And he even interestingly said the fascists. So he mixes Marxism, communism, and fascism up. And it's a weird little rhetorical move he makes where he tries to combine them into like one threat, even though he's like explicitly fascist and flirting with fascist rhetoric, and so many of his supporters are obviously incredibly willing to embrace a fascist sort of figure, but he rhetorically tries to tie that into to the left. But that idea that Trump will just come out and say, yeah, when I'm president, we're going to get rid of the socialists and the communists and the Marxists, and then Dems and liberals are like, they have their right to free speech and they can organize, as long as they aren't hurting anybody. And in fact, you going out there and fighting them in the streets is also really bad, and that's not democratic. And it's just like one of these formations is ready for a fight, and the other one absolutely is ready to get steamrolled.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, and what you said about like how he sort of puts fascism into that package, it is a brilliant rhetorical move because they're putting in the same package like the word woke, like people
Yeah.
who are woke. Those are the new fascists,
Hmm.
right? And so like everyone who listens to that kind of rhetoric is like, yeah, this is the new fascism. So the word fascism has changed now to include anti-fascists and people who are quote unquote woke.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about like your childhood, because I'm very interested. Like you've seemed like you've always had this sort of radical streak within you, and I'm wondering about your childhood, maybe your childhood experiences with racism or childhood traumas that might have played a role in like developing your political and social consciousness and pushing you in this direction of not only opposing fascism intellectually, but willing to go out there and actually confront fascists in some meaningful way in the streets.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I grew up as a Mexican kid in Boston, Massachusetts,
Mm.
which is awkward in itself. And
Enough
it's like,
said, yeah.
yeah, it sort of pushes you into this other zone automatically. But I always found people who were like me, other black and brown kids who were into hip hop and breakdancing and things like that. And I listened to a lot of rap music, um, with really revolutionary lyrics. And then I started getting into punk music. So like that was always in me. I always wanted to do something different. Uh, but there was always something in me that like I wanted to look out for people who were being left out.
Mm.
And that's something that's like been constant in my life. Even when I sort of fell off the path um, of anti-racist organizing, I always wanted to look out for the people who were being left out. So that came from a very early age, and like my parents were not there for me in the way that I needed them to be.
Mm.
So I really looked toward the punk scene to give me guidance. And so that's really where a lot of my um, revolutionary tendency came from.
And was it in that punk scene that you began to actually sort of develop explicitly anti-fascist politics and the militancy that goes along with it? Because I know in the 90s, early 2000s, and the 80s, a lot of anti-fascist organization and work was sort of centered around various music scenes and the attempt to keep Nazis out of those music scenes. So is that sort of true for your development as well?
Yeah, although I didn't know it at the time, I didn't know that it was like militancy or I didn't know that it was political. It was really just survival. Like I'm a little kid, um, and I'm young and I'm skinny and I don't know how to fight. Yet I'm going to all these shows with all these boneheads circling around in the pit and like fighting people, right? And so I really just wanted to go to shows without being picked on. Um, and so like the formation of anti-racist action was in Sacramento was really just a reaction to this horrible neo-Nazi problem we had at all the shows. And so that's where the militancy came from. Yet I didn't know it was militancy. It was really just like I want to go to these shows and get these boneheads out of here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've certainly have, I enjoy punk music and always have, but I've never gotten super deep into the genre. I've always been sort of more of a hip hop oriented guy. But what sort of bands back in the day would bring out the bonehead types? Are there some bands that would bring them out more than other bands?
It was pretty much all of them. And like, so when I moved to Davis, California, we'd have bands playing all the time, like Operation Ivy, Green Day before they were Green Day.
Mm-hmm.
They were called Sweet Children, uh, Econochrist, all these bands that were like explicitly left wing, and they talked about unity and anti-racism. Every one of those shows, Boneheads would be at.
Mm.
And there was one show where Green Day got chased out of Sacramento by Boneheads. So like, yeah, they just went to all the shows because one, they liked shows, they're fun, but another reason was they wanted to recruit, and that was like a really ripe grounds for recruitment at the time. So yeah, they were at every show. It didn't matter what the genre was, they were there.
Now, in your book, you tell many anecdotes and stories, some of them insane stories about about aspects of your life. So maybe I'll ask you throughout this interview a couple times to give us a story or two that jumps to your mind. But in the context of anti-racist action and fighting back against boneheads, or is there a particular story that jumps to mind that you could indulge us with?
I mean, there was the one I was super proud of, which was in the book, was just the one where like it was my first ARA march, and like I was super scared because boneheads actually showed up to like counter protest our march.
Hmm.
And I was able to take a full Coke can and lob it at this bonehead's head, and it split his eye open. And like I was so proud, I was super scared, but I was so proud of myself. And like I feel like I won that day. Even though I didn't, I was really proud of myself. But yeah, we there were just so many stories of like just going to shows and like getting bullied by neo-Nazis and just getting smacked around, and like that feeling of not being able to do anything about it because you don't know how to fight and you're small was just it was so humiliating. Um, yeah.
Yeah, so then that's the next question is, because you were small and at first you didn't know how to fight, how did you develop that capacity to fight, and then what eventually pushed you into more formal and structured forms of like mixed martial art fighting?
Yeah, so I didn't learn how to fight, but I did learn how to organize. Like,
Mm.
uh, my friend Aragorn at the time was like really good at organizing kids together, and so like I didn't need to know how to fight if there were 30 kids,
Mm.
because that's scary to have 30 kids coming after you. No matter how small we are or how lanky we are, how scared we are, if there's 30 of us and, four boneheads, we're probably going to win,
Yeah.
especially if we have weapons hidden in the bushes. So that was the first experience I got with like organizing a community and like, never going into a fight just by yourself. Um, that's what I learned about community and ARA. And then it wasn't until way later, until I sort of came back into the movement, when there was a neo-Nazi rally here in Sacramento, where I met all these people who were actual fighters, like MMA fighters, and they were already doing this self-defense collective. And so I started just taking their classes, and really enjoying like structured learning, and sparring and things like that. And so we started doing that, and that's really how I started learning to fight, which was in like 2015 or so.
And was that explicitly MMA, or did you start with boxing or jujitsu or anything in particular?
Yeah, it was MMA. It was really just like a really stripped down MMA. So we would do jujitsu, we would do kickboxing, boxing, um, and things like that.
Mm. Yeah, like I always have loved sports, and over the last several years, I've gotten very much into weight training and building muscle and extending my athleticism, especially as I get deeper into my 30s. I take my health more seriously, and I want to be a sort of robust person going forward. And I've always flirted with the idea of trying to do jujitsu or learn one of the martial arts in particular, even boxing, anything like that. And I sort of have been held back because I don't have health insurance, and sort of always have worried about, catastrophic costs of some sort of injury that I could possibly get. But I'm wondering if you have a pitch that you would make to some people out there. Not that everybody's going to be interested or even should be interested in such a thing, but what about it is edifying? What lessons do you learn from it? Like, like with weight training, for example, it's like you develop this discipline, you develop this sense of perseverance, overcoming discomfort, confronting discomfort, etc. And those things can transfer to other areas of your life. I'm wondering what you find to be like the most worthwhile thing about really getting into something like mixed martial arts and what it does to the mind and body over time.
Yeah, so on top of doing this self-defense collective, I actually joined a traditional jujitsu gym. Um, and it's not a leftist gym. And in fact, one of the instructors is like a pretty obviously conservative dude. But he sees my tattoos and stuff, and he asks me questions about leftist things, and like, he's pretty cordial. But going to a gym and learning techniques and sparring and using the techniques with other people and being very close to other people and like struggling with other people does something to the brain chemistry that makes you stronger. And not just stronger physically, which it does, but mentally you're stronger and you feel a deeper connection to people when you're done. So for me, jujitsu, even though the people I'm rolling with aren't leftists and I probably wouldn't hang out with them in any other situation. When we're done sparring, I feel very much more connected to humanity.
Mm.
And it's this very human, raw sort of thing that like you don't even need to be good at jujitsu or you don't need to be athletic. I've seen people come into that gym, you know, way overweight, really unsure of themselves, and they start taking the classes and like you can see it in their eyes that they're different people after a month. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's like everything about it is like it's almost this distilled human experience that I think everyone should at least try for a month to see if they like it.
Yeah, and I would assume it builds confidence, but also a calmness that can come with confidence. It's like you'll often hear things like people who train this way, they tend not. There's always exceptions, but they tend not to be going out into public looking for fights or being a super sort of aggressive person because they have this healthy outlet for that aggression and that development, and then they have a certain sort of respect for what they're able to do, such that they're not, like the guy that gets drunk at the bar and has a huge ego and wants to show everybody what he can do, sort of thing. That it seems like in the best case scenario, it sort of fundamentally humbles someone over time, because to get into a mixed martial arts, especially from a complete amateur perspective, means getting your ass kicked over and over and over and over and over again before you start learning the basics, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you'll notice like the black belts, the people who are really good, have dedicated their lives to it, are just the most calm, even-tempered people you'll meet. So there's something to that. Yeah.
Now, like you mentioned, a conservative sort of guy that you spar with, or that is at your gym, and certainly, like, there's a full spectrum of people. Like, I have no problem, being interested in and talking to and even having friendships with people who are conservative, etc. But of course, there's eventually a line where you're crossing over into fascism, Nazism, racism that can't be tolerated at all. Have you ever come across those sorts of dudes in that environment? Because I know even in Europe, especially in Europe, it's really popular with the far right to have these sort of neo-Nazi MMA training gyms, and a lot of culture centered around these gyms for that reason. I'm not saying that you've experienced that in particular, but is there a certain sort of guy from the far right that has gravitated to this sort of thing that you have to sort of navigate as somebody who's also interested?
Yeah, I mean, jujitsu especially, because it's sort of traditionally a very conservative crowd that gathers toward jujitsu. But so I've seen like a lot of sort of militia types, but not necessarily any neo-Nazis. But my philosophy is I just treat everyone as a human, um, who I want to connect with until they do something weird.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my philosophy with everything, is like, if I see you on the street, I'm gonna try to connect with you because you're a human,
Hmm.
and that's it. And especially because like I teach in a prison now,
Yeah.
and so like I'm teaching literal neo-Nazis with like swastikas on their foreheads.
Yeah.
And so like it's sort of changed the way I interact with people on a day-to-day basis.
So yeah, that's a fascinating aspect, and I had that down as something I wanted to get into. I guess we can get into it now. You spent time in jail as both an inmate and a teacher, and yeah, you talk about as a teacher, just straight up Aryan Brotherhood type dudes with swastika tattoos on their stomach. Can you tell us a little bit about that environment, some of the challenges you face teaching inmates, and what you find rewarding about that process?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I haven't really had any challenges teaching inmates. My first experience in there, my student who sat up front was like a full-on neo-Nazi. And like we were just looking at each other's tattoos like we were both from different planets. Because I have three arrows on my neck and he knew what that meant. And obviously he had swastikas on his face and I knew what that meant. But like, I go in there as someone who wants to teach them writing, and I think just the way I am with people, it's pretty disarming. So like they see a guy with like full tattoos all over, and they're like, okay, we can relate to this guy. Um, and so like that's how the relationship starts. And like I don't judge them for their crime. I don't judge them for the way they look, their tattoos, or any of that, and that comes across. So like really what happens is this classroom full of respect for
Mm.
each other. And like the mission is to learn how to write, and that's what it becomes. The challenge comes from like going into the prison and dealing with the guards and like all of the rules and like hearing the way the guards speak to the inmates. That's the hardest part of my job, is sort of navigating that. Even putting on my like Department of Corrections name badge
Hmm.
every day is sort of a struggle because I'm like, damn. I almost feel like a traitor in some sense, but I feel like it's for the greater good, but I don't know.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would argue you're going in there as a teacher to help build their literary skills and their ability to write. You're not going in there as a CO or as a cop or anything like that. So I think you're actually doing really good and important work. But I am kind of wondering if your engagement with the jail and prison system from both sides of it, like what insights you glean. You talk about just how the inmates are treated by the COs in prison. I'm wondering, if your engagement with the prison system at all has sort of opened your eyes to certain aspects of it that certainly need reform at the very least.
Yeah, I mean the whole thing is really sad. I meet some of the most brilliant people who are locked up
Mm.
and who are never getting out, and whose skills and their wisdom would be really well utilized out here. And because they've made a mistake, like a horrible mistake, sure, when they were, 16, 17 years old, they're never going to be able to contribute to this world that we live in.
Mm.
And there's a problem there. There's a huge problem there. I've done so much bullshit in my life that like maybe I should be locked away, but I just kind of lucked out and I'm not. But so yeah, there's a problem. There's a problem with the term rehabilitation. There's not a lot of rehabilitation going on in there. It's really this perpetuation of a lack of humanity and like this vicious cycle of control that doesn't lead to any kind of rehabilitation. So, the fact that they have programs in there, they have college in there is good, but it's still not enough to actually rehabilitate, as they say.
Yeah, and the whole system is fundamentally dehumanizing. And like you say, you make a mistake early in life, especially if you're from a poor black or brown community in particular, and then you're locked away for the rest of your life in a cage. That's absolutely brutal. There is like at some level, like reforms can only get you so far because the very premises of the system is so rotten to its core that it's sort of inhuman by definition.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. And like it's really easy to forget about people who are locked away when you're out here. Like it's something we just don't have to think about. So I think we need to do a little bit better at educating people about like what happens in there and how rehabilitation actually works.
Yeah. Another huge aspect of this book is sort of centered around trauma and the various responses to it. In particular, you have huge swaths of the book where you talk about your, a very excessive alcohol and drug use. And I have a separate podcast that we do with another friend of mine who's in active recovery right now. He's like 50 days sober, where we really focus on addiction and the mechanics of addiction and mental health, etc. So it's something that I am interested in personally, and
Yeah.
I have lots of addicts in my personal life as well. I'm wondering, how that if childhood trauma is attached at all to your drug and alcohol use, and if you can kind of just let listeners know some of the stuff that you cover in your book with regards to drug and alcohol use and how you sort of try to get your life on the right track.
My father was an alcoholic and an addict. Um, and he ended up having schizophrenia. So from a very early age, I understood what that was, and it's you kind of think like, well, if your father did it and you had such a bad time with him, why would you go into that same path? Um, but addiction is weird that way. You kind of just you kind of just do what you see.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that I gravitated toward drugs was really because I was so full of rage. And one of the things that would quell my rage was drugs and alcohol. Um, and so really it was and the thing was like drugs and alcohol for me were so fun. And I can still look back at those days and be like, damn, those were some good times.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
yeah,
And
yeah.
like I'd start drinking in Sacramento and somehow I'd wake up in an alleyway in San Francisco and I'd be like, yeah, that was a good night. But really, I had to figure out a way to quell my rage. Um, and I tried a lot of things. I tried AA, I tried NA. I spent time in jail. But really, what it was like physical exertion of my body, and also learning to balance the things I love. Um, those things really helped me stay away from drugs and alcohol. So like, starting to run every day was something that was so important for me to stop using. Um, Being able to like have a relationship uh, with my girlfriend, who then became my wife, learning to study academics, that really helped me. So it's like it wasn't one thing; it was this balance, this like very delicate balance of things. So like if one thing goes out, like if I hurt my leg and I can't run anymore, I can fall on all this other stuff like writing, uh, so that like my own all of my chips aren't put into one thing. Because if that happens, then I'll go right back to drinking and drug use.
Mm. Was there a moment in your life where you can kind of, this is kind of cliche, but some often people do talk like this, that there is a rock bottom moment or a period of time where you finally got sick of it and you knew you had to put your life on a different track or this wasn't going to end well? Is there a particular event or was it sort of a buildup over time?
It was a buildup because every time I thought I was at rock bottom, I would hit a new rock
Mm.
bottom. I remember, I remember I lived in Carson City, Nevada, and I was writing for this motorcycle magazine. I was an editor there, and like I went on this bender that was like it was whiskey and cocaine. And I remember one night I was in a bar hanging out with like uh the guy who owned the Bunny Ranch
Mm.
brothel.
Yeah.
And like it was just wild. And I just ended up, I don't know what I think I was drinking and driving or something. And I got pulled over and I ran away from the cops and I ran into a church to hide. And I just ended up sleeping in the church all night long. And I thought that was my rock bottom because I woke up in a church and there was like a priest shooing me away. And I'm like, well, there's my rock bottom. I don't think I've ever had a weirder, shittier experience than that. But like it got worse. It just kept getting worse. And I'd tell my girlfriend, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna stop drinking. And I'd stop drinking for a day or two. So yeah, it just really got worse and worse and worse. And I'd get better and then get worse. So it really wasn't a linear process by any means.
How did it eventually turn and do you have a certain sort of streak of sobriety at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I really sort of I started running. I think running was like the thing that I did that I was like, I can't drink while I run. I tried to like, I tried to like drink and run. Uh, and I remember running around the park and like it was cold in the morning. And I remember running and I was drunk and I'd have this big like breath cloud around me that smelled like pure whiskey.
Oh man.
So I just remember people running by me, like looking at me like, oh my God, this guy's a mess. Uh, but I couldn't do that, and so I had to stop drinking so much. And so really I got interested in running because it made me feel good at the end. And I realized like I couldn't really run if I was drinking, so I quit drinking. My fiance at the time was like uh, really encouraging me to stop drinking. So it all kind of came together at the end where I was like, okay, I do have a career and like career options in academia, so I could probably like stop doing some of the stuff I'm doing and focus on that. A very slow process.
I'm kind of interested in that transition because there's parts of the book where it just seems like your life is so sort of chaotic and out of control, and yet at the same time there's this this development of yourself to become a teacher at even the college level. So was this a sort of an overlapping thing where you were beginning on that path of becoming a teacher, also struggling with this sort of chaotic life, and then eventually the chaotic life sort of settled down and you moved more vociferously into the teaching profession, or how exactly did that process occur?
Yeah, I remember my first college class. I remember sitting there still high on methamphetamine,
Damn.
um, and just sitting there like buzzing around the room. So yeah, it was definitely an overlap. But that very same professor saw my writing and she's like, you gotta do this. And she put all this trust into me. And she would like let me watch her house while she was away.
Mm.
And I was still an active drug addict. But the fact that she trusted me and like gave me responsibilities really made me want to do better. And so while I was trying to clean up, I was still like failing at that. But in the back of my mind, I'm like, people believe in me. They think I can do it. I think I can do it. I just have to get my shit together. So like that's sort of what started the process of me moving toward academia and really getting serious about my studies.
Mm. What age around was that transition for you, more or less?
It was in my like mid to late 20s.
Okay.
Yeah, so I started a little late because I dropped out of high school and had to do all this stuff to get back on track. But yeah, it took me a while.
And was it always English for you that attracted
Yeah,
you?
it was always English and it was never gonna be anything else.
Yeah.
Like it's so funny because I really stopped going to school at around sixth grade.
Damn.
Yeah, so like I didn't really do any kind of school. I don't know how I passed anything. I mean, obviously I didn't pass high school, but um so I don't know any math. Like I don't know any
Mm.
to this day I can't do math. I can't do anything. I can write, but that's it. So like if that didn't work out, I don't know what I'd be doing.
Yeah, it's wild. Now, I know we have lots of people that listen, and just because of the nature of humanity, there are people out there that probably are in active addiction or have somebody in their life who is in active addiction. And I know it's sort of a big ask, but I'm wondering if there's somebody out there listening who might have been in a position you were in your teens or 20s, deeply addicted to various substances, whatever it may be. What advice would you give somebody who is struggling and looking to sort of get out of that sort of life?
So for me, it was running something physical. So, depending on what your ability is or what your body type is or anything, just do something that exhilarates you, that's physical. And then start a routine with it because that's sort of like really what made my mind switch from addict to athlete. And so for me, it was just a routine of doing something that really physically drained me, and looking forward to that feeling every day and realizing that I couldn't use and have that feeling. So I had to stop using. Other than that, I really relied on my friends. I have some really good friends who were not using and who really supported me. They weren't like feeding my addiction, but they were just lending an ear and coming to visit me, even at my worst. Um, but I know not everyone has that. So, you could always reach out to me uh, if you find my social media or, um, I that's one thing I like to do is just listen to people who are active addicts and sort of maybe trade some ideas around. But finding a non-judgmental person, like my older sister was for me, was really key. So I think all of those things, also finding something that you're good at and just focusing on that and realizing that like you can't do anything else that harms your body if you want to accomplish that goal. That's the one thing. Like I really wanted to be a writer so badly. I really wanted to publish. That was like the one dream I had. And so I realized like I couldn't be a degenerate and do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll link to your social medias in the show notes as well, so people out there that might want to reach out or get some help in that regards can. And I totally agree with the idea of putting all that energy into something particularly physical, if possible, because it just that positive spiral that it starts with your mental health when you become physically active can really help you sort of lift out of the mind state that you might be in when you're actively using. And I have this little phrase: it's like, when in doubt, get out of your mind and get into your body. And that works for me not only with regards to any sort of addiction, but like even just mental health issues, anxiety, depression, to sit there and ruminate, to sit there and let your mind devour itself can be really unproductive and be a downward spiral. And sometimes literally, I remember in the depths of a deep depression several years ago where I got so desperate that I literally just like put on my shoes, and I wasn't even into running or anything, but I just ran desperately out of my house and around the block just because I needed some sort of physical stimulation to just rip me out of my really morose, mental spiraling. And yeah, it wasn't the silver bullet. Of course, you have to keep coming back and find something that works for you. But in that moment, the fact that my body was just in such a desperate place that I just started running, like I was trying to run away from my problems, literally.
Yeah,
It helped a little bit.
that's exactly what it is. It's so primal and kind of weird, but like, yeah, I that's such a good saying. Because yeah, it's the physical that really kind of like stops your mind from that death spiral.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think there's like an evolutionary component there because thinking back on the long history of human beings and their development over tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, to not be active, to just sit in one space, be sedentary, it was sort of it was anti your survival. And so there is this sense in which we are wired to be active, and that could be a million different things. That you don't have to jump off the couch and become a world-class athlete, but just that physical daily activity of any sort is so crucial to us as an animal that when you're not doing that in and of itself, that can be something that can start to generate feelings like depression, anxiety, etc.
Yeah, definitely. And like, yeah, when I say like I'm a fighter, I'm not a good fighter. Like when I spar with my friends who actually are pursuing MMA careers, they kill me. They
Mm-hmm.
beat me up every single time, and I will never win against them. But it's not like being good at something that helps me control my addiction. It's just the physical exertion.
Exactly. And yeah, and of course, when you're in that realm, like to not compare yourself to others, just compare yourself to yesterday.
Yeah.
The moment, whether you're in weightlifting or a sport or anything, the moment you start saying, I want to be like that person, or, I'll never be as good as this person, I think you're sort of in a bad place. And I think it's just like, am I improving? Am I pursuing excellence in my own personal version of it, and being less concerned about what others are doing? I think that's a helpful mind state as well.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
I do wonder, I've talked to lots of addicts in my life, and like I said, we even have a show where we mostly focus on that, and I've heard mixed things about AA and NA. For some people, it's an absolute lifesaver. For others, it was not helpful at all. In some instances, it was counterproductive. You were talking earlier about having good sets of friends, a sort of community that had your back, even if it is just like one person in your life who's willing to be there for you, not be an enabler, but be a sort of support system. Some people that don't have that, they find that in AA and NA. Do you have any personal thoughts on those two things? Did you have a good experience with them, or did you find them unhelpful ultimately?
Well, for me, I found them unhelpful, but I could see how people like, especially I had a sponsor in NA, and he was all about it. And like the thing was though, he made his entire life about it. Like
Mm,
his entire personality was derived from NA. And like for fun on nights, he'd like get a bunch of friends together and they'd cruise NA meetings and stuff like that. And like
mm,
that just wasn't the life for me at all. I didn't want to I didn't want to base my life around my addiction. I just wanted to leave my addiction entirely. So
right.
like yeah, for me NA didn't work. And I remember my first NA meeting, there was this lady who told this story. She was like an older white lady who told this story about like she was so into cocaine that one night she did a bunch of coke and then her nose started bleeding and then she started eating her blood
Mm,
just to taste cocaine again.
Jesus.
I was like, dude, this is not where I want to be right now.
That's
I'm like,
insane.
I don't want to hear this story. It's making me like, yeah, it didn't like click for me that way. So like, I had to find something else.
Yeah.
But yeah, I used to be pretty down on AA and NA, but now I'm just like, if it works for you, fine. But it didn't really click with me.
Yeah, and that's pretty common. But yeah, for some people it does work, and of course, if that's you, then awesome. But it's certainly worth trying if
Yeah.
you are in active addiction, and maybe it'll catch on. And a lot of it does depend on which sort of one you go to, right? You could have many in one city, and some are absolutely terrible. Some are more conducive to your situation, and so just it's worth exploring if you haven't.
Yes, absolutely.
But another thing that stood out in your book and obviously resonates with me as a father is your shift into fatherhood and that perspective shift that it gave you, but also some of the backlash you get from family members with regards to how you're raising your kids, right? This fear that you're raising them to, as you put it in the book, I think something like to be like far left extremists or something.
Yeah, right.
Can you talk about fatherhood, how it changed you, sort of what it's taught you, and navigating some of those challenges with family?
Yeah, I mean, it's taught me the ultimate patience, and this sense of like responsibility for other people. Really, my only job, I think, as a parent is to raise kind children who go out into the world with a sense of like ferocity. So I just want them to be kind to other people. I'm not big on, even though I'm a college professor, I'm not big on academics. Like I feel like once you find a passion, you can really hone in on academics. But as long as you're getting through, but being kind to everyone you meet along the way, I feel like that goes really far. So my kids know my politics, and we talk about racism, we talk about organizing and things like that, and all the stuff that I do. But I want them to have their own brains. I want them to have their own ways of thinking and their own conclusions that they reach based upon the world we live in. Um, so yeah, that it's and I really feel like creativity is a huge part of my life, and I want my kids to be creative. I want them to be creative with like everything, the way they interact with the world, the way they, write, with the way they look. Like I want them to look any way they want. And so yeah, so coming from a family that's very conservative, um, except for they're like Democrat conservatives, which is even weirder.
Hmm.
They just don't understand any of it. They're like very traditional. You have to do these certain things in order to be a good person. And I'm not doing any of those things, so they think I'm not a good person.
Mm. Have they read the book or have any willingness to read the book?
I don't know. Like
Yeah.
my parents, I haven't talked to them in a long time. So
Mm.
yeah, they kind of cut me off of any kind of communication. My sisters have read the book and they love it. And they
Right.
think it's like, really sweet and fair. I'm very hard on myself in the book. It's not some book where I just congratulate myself on a job well done.
Right.
Uh, but it does really try to analyze like what went wrong, and like, it wasn't the fault of my parents. And like I don't think that really comes across in the book that
Mm.
like I'm blaming them for anything. It's just the way I was raised. They thought it was right. Um, but yeah, so I'm not sure if they've read it, and I don't think they will read it.
Mm. Yeah, you seem to in the book you seem to have like genuine compassion for them, like trying to understand where they're coming from and sort of allowing them to be, to have their own opinions, even though they are sort of abrasive in certain ways. So yeah, I thought your depiction of your relationship was a very human and compassionate one that took into account their flaws without being harshly judgmental in any way.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Beautiful. Well, we're coming up on an hour here. Is there anything else about the book that you wanted to talk about? Anything that maybe took you by surprise when you were writing the book, or just any perhaps even story that you would want to tell from the book, or anything like that?
Well, I'd like people to read it and sort of base their opinion on anti-fascism after reading it. I think there are a lot of people, and maybe they're listening, who are sort of like on the fence about anti-fascism and what it means. And I'd like them to read the book just to see. But when the first editor edited this manuscript, she's like, people are going to be really mad at you after they read this book. And I was like, who's going to be mad? And she's like, everybody. She's like, you don't let anyone off the hook in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of thought about that, and I'm like, yeah, I guess that's true. Like no one gets off the hook easily. But I feel like if it's written in a real way, I don't think anyone does get off the hook because we're all flawed.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all these contradictory people who, maybe we try to do the right thing, but we don't always do the right thing. And the point of the book is like, you can learn. That's the only thing you can do is learn.
Yeah.
And as long as you're actively learning and actively trying to be compassionate, then you should be okay. So yeah, I'm sort of interested to see how people react to the writing.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the writing genuinely. I found a core tenet in the text to be this humility that you display yourself, and it's incredibly humanizing. One of the things about, especially in the last several years, anti-fascism, as we were saying earlier in the conversation, is that there is this concerted attempt to demonize people who are engaged in that activity or that have those politics. And even, being a socialist or an anarchist or a communist in American society is already taboo, already anathema. And many people don't know anybody in their lives that are like that, which makes it much easier to dehumanize those people. And once you start down the path of dehumanizing entire groups of people, well, we know where that can lead. And so one of the things that I try to do with this show, and I think you do really well with this book, is to fully humanize these politics through your own person, right? To show people that you can disagree with me, you can not have the same opinions, you could judge me for my life, but I'm a human being trying my best. And I found that when I'm talking to people who are, their politics give them every reason to be hostile towards me as somebody who is, a self-described socialist, Marxist, etc., I find that when they can connect to my human side first, they're much more willing to listen to my political views and much more willing to not necessarily dehumanize the next person that identifies as such, because now they have somebody in their head who they personally know who is that as well, and they might not agree with it, but that's a human being. And I think that in and of itself can be progressive.
Yeah. What was that word you used? Anathema?
Anathema? Yeah.
That's a good one. I gotta look that up and then start using it.
But yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciated the book. I really appreciate you taking an hour of your time to come on and talk with us. Can you let listeners know where they can find you and your book online? And let us know if do you have any other future projects or a future book on your mind that you want to start working on soon?
Yeah, so I'm working on a couple books right now, a book of fiction and then a nonfiction book about running. But
nice.
Yeah, this book, The Hands That Crafted the Bomb, you can find at pmpress.org. And they have an event schedule, so you can see the events that I'm doing in support of the book. And PM Press has tons of titles, politics, poetry, fiction, all kinds of stuff. So if this book isn't your cup of tea, there's tons of stuff over on PM Press. So check it out.
And do you have any social media or anything you want to share with folks?
Instagram, 3_arrows is where I usually post stuff.
Sweet. All right. I will link to the socials. I will link to PM Press's release of your book and their event schedule. People can reach out to you on Instagram if they want to touch base with you, to ask you a question, anything like that. And yeah, thank you so much. Let me know when you come out with any other work in the future. I'd love to have you back on, and I really appreciate you taking time with us today.
Appreciate you. Thanks so much.